I can't even begin to tell you, first of all, how thankful I am. I mean, for me, it was like a nostalgic trip being able to watch that documentary. So many of the bands like I grew up with, was that kind of like the feeling for you behind it? I know you're all about this scene, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of came up playing in the scene. Like I'm a trumpet player, and I've played in ska bands since like 1998. So these were the bands I was opening for and playing with and looking up to the whole time I was playing in ska bands. So yeah, 100%. It was. I mean, that's why we made the movie, and why it's why it meant so much to me. It was such a I don't know. It's like almost a crazy, like a trip to make it, to get to like talk to all my favorite bands about my favorite music.
And it seems like you definitely had that reception from the bands. I mean, you got the who's who of the scene chiming in the documentary. So I'm guessing that time while you were playing, you kind of made those bonds, made those connections.
Yeah, me and my producer on the movie, Ray, who was also in a ska band with me in the early 2000s, he maintained more connections than I did. He still works in the ska scene, more in Japan, but he had those connections still. I mean, I had like Aaron Barrett's old AOL email address in my
Ew.
old email account from the 90s, but as far as keeping in touch with people, I hadn't really. I'd been playing in DC for a while, so I was kind of still in touch with like the Pie Tasters and some of the Boss Stones guys. But beyond that, it was really just once we started reaching out to people. The ska community is so small, it spread really fast. Once you talk to three or four bands, they start telling the other bands, "Hey, somebody's making a movie. Hey, if this guy calls, it's legit. It's, it's a real thing." So that helped a lot to have sort of the bands vouching for us as we went.
Was it always kind of like the narrative of the documentary that you really wanted to cover, really like the full spectrum? Because there's so many different avenues of ska. I mean, this is really telling the origins, telling where it is today. I mean, like there's so many different aspects of it. It's almost like you could have had multiple movies within itself.
You definitely could have, and there are some great documentaries out there about two tone and about original Jamaican ska. And this was my era of ska, was the '90s that I grew up with. So we kind of wanted to focus there, but then we also thought if we do a good enough job and if this reaches a wide enough audience, we want to make sure we include all those, the history that came before it and the modern ska that came after it, because I assume for most people, this is going to be the only movie about ska they ever see. So we felt like it was important to at least touch on all of that, at least provide the historical background for how we got to the '90s, so that if people, and a lot of people have told us that they didn't even listen to ska music and they watched this movie and they learned basically everything they know about ska is whatever we put in the movie. So we wanted to make sure we included a lot.
Yeah, and it even seems there's people like that don't even realize they were listening to ska, didn't know this band was actually a ska band, and they may have transcended a little bit like a band like No Doubt. But I mean, here it is. You've been listening to it the whole time, and you didn't even know it.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a big thing. My whole life, I told people I played in a ska band, and their immediate response was, "What's that? What do you mean what? You play trumpet? Is that like jazz? What are you doing?" That kind of thing. And so that was, we knew we wanted to address that in the movie, of like this, this thing that everybody has heard. It's in, it was in Target commercials and it was all over the place and it was so ubiquitous for so long. And it still is in like cartoons and advertising and movies. You still hear it, but most people don't know what it's called, and they certainly don't know where it came from.
Yeah, especially even how you guys highlighted with the Aquabats, how they got involved in like more of that kid-friendly television.
Yeah, yeah. Their story is great because they really embraced the cartoonishness of it. Their live show is like a live cartoon. I don't know if you've ever been to an Aquabats show, but they're all in costume and they have villains in character suits, and they act out fight scenes and they play cartoons on a screen behind them and all this crazy stuff. And that, that's really the wacky side of 90s ska. And then they took that and they went on to do Yo Gabba Gabba and have their own TV show that's, you could argue it's for kids.
But which is even funny too. I mean, just knowing way back when that was Travis Barker on drums for them all that time, and see like how he evolved, transplants and Blink and whatnot. I mean, it's such a crazy thing knowing that you have this unbelievable drummer that is part of his ska. Because people think of, like, when they think of ska, they think of the horn section and all that dancing type music. They don't really put two and two with drums, but here it is. You got that elite drummer that was a part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And people, that's one thing we didn't get into that much in the movie that, looking back, we might have done more on, but the musicianship is, super impressive a lot of the time. And it doesn't get enough credit because of the mainstream, the ska punk kind of, I don't know, it got a little bit of that negative connotation from punk rock where it's like, it's just power chords and, they're just 3 chords and they're singing and then it's the horns, but it's not like, they're not playing like jazz or classical. They're just playing marching band stuff. But, if you dive into some of these bands, some of these like the New York Ska Jazz Ensemble and Tokyo Ska Paradise Orchestra, the musicianship is like next level. These guys are amazing players, and a lot of the drummers in ska and the bass players and keyboard players and horn sections, they're some of the best musicians. They just happen to play this upbeat, fun music.
Yeah, and it's almost like, they have the whole jam music scene, how these bands basically, rather than play a song that's like a 4-minute song, are able to jam off of each other. Ska bands are able to really do that same type of thing, that bonding of musicianship, like you said, just really play off of each other.
Well, it's because a lot of them did come from like classically trained music backgrounds. These guys could totally play, 4 hours of jazz in a night, but instead they're playing, a ska cover of Come On Eileen. But it's still great musicians, and that, I think it's often underappreciated genre.
Could you ever see kind of maybe a revival? I mean, music is subjective. What, 1 second it's hot, 1 second it's not. I mean, you got even Gwen kind of not necessarily completely ska, more of a reggae sound with that song "Let Me Reintroduce Myself." I mean, it charted pretty high. It's making waves, and she kind of spoke about how the origins of ska and reggae, she wanted to bring back that sound. So who knows? Maybe this is its start again.
Yeah, and it has been growing a lot in the past few years. When we started making the movie, I had no idea how much it was going to grow in the past few years. We had things like the Back to the Beach Festival, which was a ska-based music festival in 2018 and 2019, had 50,000 people at it, and it was just ska. It was a ska music festival. And you'd have bands like the Interrupters that just came out. I mean, they've been doing it a long time, but they hit the radio a couple of years ago. And, they were supposed to, in 2020, play this big Fall Out Boy Weezer arena tour. And that didn't happen, but that's still, I think, signs of ska music inching its way back towards the mainstream again. But it's never left, really. It's still around, just like we say in the movie. A lot of the bands from the 90s are still playing. A lot of bands from the 60s and the 80s are still playing. And there's new bands all the time. And it just keeps growing and expanding. And the beauty of like the world we live in now with the internet is if somebody can hear Gwen Stefani say something about ska on an interview because she's trying to promote a new song, and you can type it in to Google or Spotify or iTunes or whatever, and there's like 1,000 great bands. And the big problem now is like, where do you start? Because there's so many. But it's great that it never went away, and it does come and go from the mainstream, top 40 radio. But I could totally see it coming back. But what's more likely, I think, is music becoming popular that was influenced by this. Because you have all these musicians growing up now that, when they were kids, they listened to Streetlight Manifesto, or they listened to, you know, even generationally, you know, kids grew up listening to Gwen Stefani, who was influenced by Madness, and then, you know, it trickles down. So you'll hear some crazy amalgamation of new music. That's electronic music, but it's got a ska backbeat, or it's got a vibe to it. It's got a horn section. And I think that's really cool. And that's something we're seeing now, that, you know, that's the new iteration of ska. It can take any form.
Yeah, everything has a way of I guess, circulating, recycling, and coming back in. I mean, even if there's only aspects of it. So, I mean, that said, with that, do you think we're hurt by something like the Warped Tour kind of going under? Because, I mean, that was something that kind of brought a lot of that scene to the forefront, and it's no longer there.
Yeah, I mean, I know ska people in the ska community, we were all bummed when we heard Warped Tour was ending, but you know, that I think that's more of that evolution of what people want out of live music. You see a lot more big festivals now, or not now, but in 2019. You see it going the way of like the big once a year, you know, your Coachellas and your whatever Firefly music festivals that have all the bands from the radio, and the kids can go and pay their $300 for the weekend and see every band they care about and hang out with all their friends and do all their drugs. And then that's it. That's live music for those young kids. And the struggle, I think, is the small club shows and the touring bands and the, like, I see this cycle, and I think it's starting to come back, or it was before the pandemic, where there are young people who are starting to go back to the smaller shows and the all ages shows. But I don't know. I think that stuff all comes and goes, just like everything else. And Warped Tour going away is a huge bummer because of the way that tour, you know, was like one of these big festivals, but they always brought on the new bands and the small indie bands and tried to. Yeah, and that was, I loved Warped Tour for that, where you could go to see Less Than Jake or to see, you know, Blink-182 or whoever was headlining, but you'd also see like 40 opening bands and like 20 local bands that maybe you didn't know existed, and then you could follow them for the next 5 years until it was just a cool thing, and maybe that doesn't exist anymore, and that's a bummer.
What do you think the biggest takeaway that people should kind of resonate with after watching your documentary? I mean, there's so many different aspects. I mean, I feel like I learned a bunch of stuff, that even knowing like the stuff with the Mighty Mighty Boss Stones and all that, the history of like how they didn't even want to appear in the movie Clueless. Like, I didn't know it was like that. So, I mean, it's interesting that you get so many different things, but is there kind of a unified takeaway that you have?
I mean, I hope the takeaway for people that watch the movie is that if they used to be into ska, they remember and they get back into it and they go to a show, check out a new band. If they never knew about ska, maybe it just opens them up a little bit to this genre of music. But my favorite takeaway when we first started showing it to people was there was somebody who saw an early screener who was a friend of one of the producers who played in like a metal screamo kind of band, who used to just really make fun of ska. Like, it's a joke. These people are idiots, bunch of dorks playing this music. And he was like, oh man, I learned a lot from your movie, and I don't think I'm going to make fun of ska anymore. And that was my favorite takeaway, is like, it's legitimate. It's a real thing. And it means a lot to a lot of people. And that, you know, it can be taken as seriously as rock and roll or jazz or punk rock or any of these things that everybody has some level of respect for. And so my hope is that people would see our little ska movie and learn just enough to appreciate it, to take it seriously as a genre.
But even while taking it seriously as a genre, also learn that ska doesn't hold any value to like a specific type of person. It's all colors, all creeds, and it's really around to kind of get everybody dancing. It's like one of those, even if you're basically one of those people that stand at the back of the room and isn't like getting in onto the floor dancing. There's no way you can watch a ska band play and not have movement. Your foot's going to start stomping. Your hand's going to start tapping. That's ska.
Yeah. Yeah, and that, I think, is the undeniable factor. Like, once people realize, oh, that's that kind of music that I've heard my whole life, it does always make my head bob. Or, you know, it is fun, and it does make you move. And that's the power of the music. That's just like the upbeat and the, you know, the fast rhythm. It just makes, I'm moving thinking about ska.
Yeah.
That's how strong it is, you know?
So what's the band that needs to highlight the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? They're getting everybody else in there.
I mean, I don't know. I don't follow the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And like, if you had asked me if the Specials were in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I would have said, of course they are. So if they're not, it should be them next. You know, the Scatolites, they've been doing it for, God, 60 years. That's been a band. Of the 90s bands, I think the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones deserve a spot in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame alongside anybody from that era. Rancid, maybe.
Awesome. Well, anything you'd like to add? I mean, maybe are we going to see a sequel to this? Because you said lots changed over the last few years. Is there another project on the horizon?
Well, I did just release my next movie that I was working on at the same time. It's called The Last Blockbuster. It's about the last blockbuster video remaining in the world. It's here in Oregon where I live. And that's out now. And that was my next project. I don't have a next project after that yet because I've been in lockdown for about a year. So we'll see.
So if somebody went to Oregon right now, they could go to that Blockbuster and pick up your movie about Blockbuster,
Yep.
Right?
Yep, and the ska movie too. It's on the shelf at Blockbuster to rent.
That's got to be kind of surreal, seeing a movie about Blockbuster at Blockbuster.
Yeah, that was our goal from day one with that movie was I hope we can finish it because we didn't know if they were going to stay open, you know, or how long. We really hope we can finish it in time to get it on the shelf at Blockbuster. And right now, they've told us, at least for this location, it's the #1 documentary they've ever had. It's renting like crazy and selling copies. But it's also on iTunes and Amazon and all that, so people who don't live here can see it too.
And is that kind of the same thing with the Ska documentary too? They can kind of watch it at different platforms?
Yeah, it's on Amazon and Vimeo, and we sell the DVD Blu-ray combo at skamovie.com.
Awesome. Well, hey, I really appreciate your time. Again, if anything else you'd like to add, websites or anything, by all means.
Yeah, I mean, check us out. We're on Instagram at Ska Movie and Facebook and all that.
Awesome. Hey, thanks again for your time and bringing me back to the 90s.
No problem. Thanks for having me.